What's up everyone, it's Matt Martin with the Grass Factor. I promised I would do a video that is all about ammonium sulfate, so wanted to take the time and go ahead, get that video done today. Okay, so when we're talking about ammonium sulfate, remember this is a continuation of the difference between your nitrogen sources, your slow-release nitrogen sources, which typically stem from urea. Those sources are going to be involving different types of polymer coatings or denitrification inhibitors or urease inhibitors to slow the conversion that takes place with urea, which is urea reacting with urease and then the production of NH3 and CO2. So what we have when we're dealing with ammonium sulfate, you're dealing with the ammonium ion, which is NH4, and you're dealing with the sulfate ion, which is SO4. What's different between this and urea is that in addition to the nitrogen portion of it, which would come from ammonium, you also have sulfate, which is also going to provide elemental plant available sulfur, not to be confused with elemental sulfur that would affect soil pH, but the sulfate ion is readily able to be taken up by plant roots and provide a sulfur source to plants. So immediately off the bat, you're getting two available nutrients instead of just one nutrient when going out with ammonium sulfate. There's a couple of things to keep in mind in regards to risks with ammonium sulfate. Ammonium sulfate has a high salt index. The other thing too is that it is a soil acidifier. The interesting thing about this is that it's not the sulfate ion that causes the soil acidity, it's the ammonium ion, and the breakdown of ammonium, once it reacts with water, it gives off these positively charged hydrogen ions, which is what releases acidity into the soil. Also, in terms of cost, it is relatively expensive per pound of actual N going out. Now, in terms of advantages, and we'll kind of go through the list and talk about each of these points about what makes it important to keep in mind as a risk, and also what makes it important to keep in mind that it's not so much of a risk. One thing to just kind of highlight here is in terms of agriculture, some crops are going to be more responsive to ammonium sulfate than other crops. So for instance, rice is one of those ones that never did really do well with ammonium sulfate. So what happened in particular with rice was that you had an abundance of iron uptake in the plant, and what would happen is that you would have a decreased yield as a result. And this was due to the drop in soil pH. It would allow for greater uptake of iron. So in terms of rice, you could see where something like that may be bad. However, in terms of turf grass, you could see where additional iron uptake would be positive. That acidifying effect on that soil will lead to a wider range of micronutrients that are to be taken up and ultimately give you a darker green grass. The other thing to keep in mind too is that if your pH drops too low, so we're talking mid-4s and lower, aluminum uptake begins to occur, and aluminum can have toxic, phytotoxic effects to plants. So it's important to know your soil pH if you're going to go out with a product like ammonium sulfate. And just real quick to touch on what we were talking about with the additional iron uptake. Interestingly, the use of ammonium sulfate shows plant tissue analysis have higher instances of iron as well as magnesium, and it's actually above pretty significantly of leaps and bounds over urea. The only thing that would be even remotely close would be potassium nitrate showed very similar elevated levels of iron in particular. So in how this correlates with turf grass, higher instances of plant tissue iron and magnesium means that the plant is going to have higher concentrations of chlorophyll, which in turn means we have darker color. And of course, darker color is a bit of the name of the game. So let's first talk about how this applies to turf grass. Ammonium sulfate again is applying nitrogen and sulfur. Sulfur is depending on which piece of research you're looking at, would be considered a secondary nutrient. It's still a macronutrient, but a secondary nutrient. And then in the older instances, it was considered a micronutrient. The advantage of using this ammonium form of nitrogen is that you limit the amount of nitrogen loss that occurs through NH3 volatilization. So especially if you're dealing with a soil type that is already neutral in pH or a slightly acidic in pH, you really cut down on that NH3 volatilization down to next to nothing, which is awesome. So it's an efficient fertilizer to go out with. Now, ammonium sulfate is also a better end source for saline soils. These are going to be soils that contain higher instances of sodium. Ammonium sulfate actually will decrease the effects of sodium chloride, NaCl. And as well as in SODIC soils, it's actually going to improve soil structure. In terms of soil acidification, what ends up happening is that you have, when that soil acidification takes place in the rhizosphere of the plant, so in and around that root zone, you get an increase in phosphorus availability, and you also have an increase in phosphorus rock uptake, so that would be a soil applied phosphorus, and you also have, of course, with lower pH, a higher micronutrient uptake. The other advantage too is that ammonium sulfate does not lead to CO2 emissions like urea does. Again, urea is going to convert to NH3 and CO2. CO2, of course, being lost as a gas to the environment. And then, of course, you're doing a little bit of this research, and this kind of goes back to the old turf grass days, is that the acidifying effect in the root rhizosphere may lead to a decrease in the ability for some diseases, some root-borne diseases, root-borne pathogens, such as rhizoctonia solani, to have a decreased effect. However, we'll jump into a little bit of that later. That's subjective at best. Also, ammonium sulfate, the ammonium portion of this, is much less volatile than your other end sources. So your ammonia or even your ammonium nitrate. Your nitrate is going to be much more subjected to leaching, whereas you'd be relying more on just the ammonium portion of your ammonium nitrate. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the acidification effects on the soil. What's interesting about this, again, just to reiterate, the sulfate ion does not acidify the soil. It is a plant available form of sulfur, but it is not that causes the issue. So it's, again, like I said earlier, it's the ammonium portion of it. So what happens is ammonium will react with a specific bacteria in the soil, and it will lead to production of NO3 and hydrogen ions, positively charged hydrogen ions. An acidic soil has a higher concentration of positively charged hydrogen ions. Now, the issue with this is that this AMS, when reacts with water, you get 2HNO4 plus 3O2. So for you get 2 parts of ammonium and 3 parts oxygen that release at the soil surface. This oxygen release at the soil surface is very beneficial in terms of microbiology. They will be gravitating towards this oxygen that exists at the soil surface, and then it also plays into some things we'll talk about later on in terms of nutrient availability. But as that release happens, again, there's more reactions that take place with very specific bacteria, which is going to lead to the production of 2 parts of NO2, which is nitrite. It's also going to lead to 2 parts water and 4 parts hydrogen, positively charged hydrogen ions. So for every 1 part ammonium sulfate applied to the soil, ultimately you're getting 4 parts of hydrogen ions, and that's what leads to the acidifying effect. Okay, now what's interesting about this is that in terms of combating that, it roughly takes 5 pounds of calcium carbonate to negate the effects of ammonium sulfate. So just keep that in mind. And to break this down into a chart, sand is quicker to acidify than a clay or even a loam. So if you are trying to drop your pH to a 4.5 and you have a current pH of 5.0, you would only need 175 pounds of ammonium sulfate to bring a 5.0 to a 4.5. In a loam, you would need 530 pounds of ammonium sulfate to drop a 5 to a 4.5. And in clay, you would need 800 pounds to drop a 5 to a 4.5. Again, this is be pounds per acre. Now, if we're bringing that down from a 5.5, in sand, we're looking at 350 pounds. Loam, we would need 1050. And in clay, we would need 1,600 pounds per acre to drop a 5.5 to a 4.5. In turn, if we were at a 6, all of a sudden at a loam, we would need 1,540, and we would need 2,310 pounds per acre to bring a 6 to a 4.5 in clay soil. So if you're dealing with clay and loam soils, this may be an important tool for you to use or keep in mind if you have to negate the effects of the ammonium sulfate. And an important thing to do too is keep in mind of how much you're going to be applying per acre over the course of the year. If you're applying 800 pounds per acre over the course of the year, that would be approximately 4 pounds of N. Then you may, if you have an existing pH of 5, you may drop that to a 4.5, which would be an issue. At that point, you would need to apply approximately, you would need 2 tons per acre of your calcium carbonate, so your lime, to negate that effect. If you need to move it up a point, again, quickly, you can use something like a fast-acting lime, and that's going to cut down that PHCA technology. That polycarboxylic acid will allow that to happen much more quickly. So the other thing we want to talk about is the salt index. So this goes into the risk of using ammonium sulfate. Ammonium sulfate has a high salt index. It's going to be not quite 2x that of urea. I would say that you're twice as likely to burn something. So at 1 pound of N per 1,000 square feet going down in terms of foliar fertilizer, you would, if that began to tip burn, you would also see the same tip burn at about a ½ pound of N per 1,000 square feet of ammonium sulfate. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Interestingly, the tip burn that does occur with ammonium sulfate, these are studies that were done on bent grass, was that it actually recovered really quickly within a week. Usually the tip burn tend to correct itself with a little bit of mowing. It would mow out the damage. In terms of volatilization and overall performance of ammonium sulfate, it is as low in terms of volatility as most of our nitrogen sources, better than our other nitrogen sources. And this would be due to the ammonium ion. It's positively charged, and it's going to bond with the negatively charged ions in the soil that slow that leaching that takes place. In terms of denitrification, there are several different interactions and reactions that have to occur in the soil with different bacteria in order to even produce nitrate or nitrite for that to happen. So you would rely on NH4 to convert to nitrite, NO2, and then nitrite would have to react with more bacteria to then become NO3, which would be subject to loss. Versus in urea, you'll have that conversion that happens relatively quickly with NH3 and then to NO3 and then converted to N2, which is nitrogen, and then N2O, nitric oxide, which would ultimately lead to faster instances of volatilization. Now, with the whole, rhizosphere pH and effect on rhizoctonia solani, again, it goes back to agriculture and agricultural testing. At 40 pounds per acre, they saw no change. At 80 pounds per acre of ammonium sulfate, they saw less instances of rhizoctonia solani. Now, that was attempted to be repeated in many different ways, and it was also studied for long-term effects. And long-term, it did not continue to have that same effect cumulatively year over year over year. So there's not a lot of hard science that would say that it does indeed lead to fewer instances of brown patch outbreak in turf grasses that are going to be susceptible to brown patch. However, one thing that is working in this advantage is going to be, again, that release of oxygen at the soil surface, which will allow to a natural colonization of predator-specific pathogens for rhizoctonia solani. This would be, your bacillus varieties and stuff that in harmony can tend to alleviate a bit of the pressure that occurs with rhizoctonia solani. So the other thing that's interesting about the presence of oxygen at the soil surface is that that oxygenated surface will also lead to a decrease in denitrification. And this is because it typically is required to have low oxygen environment, so a waterlogged soil, for that NH4 to NO2 conversion to NO3 conversion to take place. So by having adequate moisture levels as well as an oxygen-rich soil surface, it will typically slow that conversion from taking place, which in turn will lead to less denitrification. That's going to be the highlights on ammonium sulfate, and that is particularly why I use it. It tends to be more of a high risk, high reward type outfit, but at the same time, in terms of the amount of loss that does not occur by using ammonium sulfate, I'm able to back down my nitrogen rates overall. So one of the experiments I'm doing this year is, instead of running 4.5, 5 pounds of N per year, I'm going to be dropping that down to 2.5 pounds of N, maybe 2 3/4, maybe 3, depending on how the weather and cultural practices I face on homeowner lawns turn out. So what I would actually be spending in urea, I would be saving. It would be a moot point, a moot effect. It cancels each other by going to ammonium sulfate, because I would ultimately be using less N. Less N would be required because of the efficiency I would be getting out of the ammonium sulfate. This also goes into ammonium sulfate being having faster uptake in cooler weather. Obviously in cooler weather, what happens is urease, the enzyme that is going to convert urea into ammonia gas to be taken up by the plant. In cooler weather, it is not as effective, so that conversion does not take place really well, whereas ammonium can be taken up. The other advantage too is that, for instance, fall applied ammonium sulfate and early spring applied ammonium sulfate can last for an extremely long period of time. And the reason being is that nitrogen in general is very stable, in a stable form in cooler weather. So when applied in late fall with cooler weather, it's going to remain in that soil for a very long period of time. And because ammonium sulfate is so efficient, you're not going to suffer as much loss as you potentially could when you're dealing with urea and the conversion to a gas and ammonia form. And so again, that would tie over into the spring when you're applying it in the spring. Early spring, when it's still cold outside, it allows you to get that application down, and it's going to be stable, and it will last for a very long time without being subjective to the leaching and volatilization. So all in all, that was the difference, the game changer for me in choosing to go with ammonium sulfate. And then on the back end of that would be the utilizing sulfur as an element in turfgrass, and also the additional plant tissue results with increased amounts of iron and increased amounts of magnesium. So we get the oxygen release, we get higher micronutrient uptake. I can deal with the acidifying effect of the soil. I don't apply foliarly, so I'm not as concerned with tip burn as I would be. But if I was applying foliarly, instead of going out with a full pound of N from urea, I would only be going out with a half pound of N from ammonium sulfate. So therefore cutting my risk to even need to run those high amounts of N. So as it comes down to it, we've got lower inputs, so I'll be cutting down my overall amounts of N applied. I'm going to have an oxygen release at the soil surface, which can lead to higher instances of beneficial bacteria, microbes, pathogens that can fight things like rhizoctonia solani. The additional oxygen at the soil surface is going to decrease the amount of volatilization and leaching that occurs. The ammonium form in general is going to help with cool weather uptake and cool weather longevity. So being able to get that fertilizer out early, and that way as weather permits, I will get a faster green up as well as a darker green up from it. So all in all, ammonium sulfate for me is a win-win on many different fronts, and I'm super excited for how so far the results I'm getting from this season. So anyway, y'all, I hope you learned something. If you did, please click the subscribe button. That's what tells me to keep going. And if you if you have any questions, feel free to email me at thegrassfactor@gmail.com. I can't thank y'all enough for this. I still can't believe this is happening. So again, thank you to each and every one of you. I really appreciate it. Y'all have a good one. Take it easy.